Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 16. Today we'll discuss evaluating sources using Craap. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to one source that you would like to use or are thinking about using for Project 3, and you'll also need a document to write on. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. First, we'll discuss the need for source evaluation in academic writing. We'll then define the components of the Craap principles of evaluation. And finally, we'll examine critical questions and concerns when evaluating sources. All right, jumping into all of this, why do we need to evaluate sources anyway? Why do we need to think critically about what an article is saying, who wrote it? Like, why do we need to give it all this thought? In 2019 terms, the easiest way to describe that is fake news. So we live in this hashtag fake news, post-truth type of society where we always want to make sure that the information that we are reading and engaging with and incorporating into our own writing reflect the most accurate information possible. Because information is now so easy to circulate, we're in this position where we really can't trust everything that we read as we might have been able to do so in years past. Because really anyone can write a blog that says anything and circulate it, and depending on how well it's written, it might come off as authoritative, it might come off as being accurate, but this is why we want to evaluate the various sources that we're using, even if they are scholarly, even if they are academic. They might not be fake news, but there might be other concerns that reflect, if they'll be appropriate for our own work or not. So in a more popular, everyday applicable sense, we evaluate sources, or we should evaluate sources, to ensure that the information that we are internalizing and sort of negotiating into the information and knowledge that we already have on a topic, to make sure that it's correct and accurate before we act upon it or circulate it. In academic writing, it's just to make sure, of course, that the content is correct and that it's appropriate for the work that you're doing and the audience that you're writing for. What we're going to do then today is we're going to talk about source evaluation through looking at the Craap principles. Now, this is also the method that I ask you to use for Project 3, the annotated bibliography. There are, of course, other methods of evaluating sources, and there are different ways that you can approach this, but I find that the Craap method um, it's well-rounded. It allows you to look at all of the important components of what makes a source. And I've also found that it is fairly interdisciplinary. So even though that you're being probably introduced to this concept and asked to demonstrate this concept in an English class, this method of evaluation will serve you well, if you take a business class or a chemistry class or a theater class or anything along those lines. It's typically tends to translate well to any kind of, I would say, academic text or even popular text that you happen to come across. Now, Craap stands for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. And again, by looking at each one of these individually and putting them in concert with one another toward the end, you can better determine, first and foremost, is this information correct? But also, is this information appropriate for what I'm trying to do? And would my audience find this an acceptable source? So it allows you to think about it, not just for the accuracy of the information, but how well received it will be, considering, again, what you're writing on, the argument you're making, and who you're trying to convince. Currency. So that's going to be the first component that we look at. This is pretty much the timelessness of the information. Some topics, as you might have seen in prior research endeavors that you might have undergone, some topics can be time sensitive. So, fields that I've often seen and that students have expressed seeing a very making sure that information is timely, think about tech. There are certain sciences where there are new discoveries coming out every day, and you have to make sure that that information is up to date. Also, social sciences as well tend to want the most recent information being cited. So, for example, let's say you are writing on cancer treatments or ways to treat cancer. For currency, you might find yourself saying, okay, well, because my audience really values the most up-to-date information, perhaps this article from 1997 just won't cut it. I need to have an article from 2015, 2016, 2017, and so on. Same thing with tech. Let's say you're writing on, computers and how to get the most out of your computer or something along those lines. You're not going to want to cite an article from 1987 that talks about an early gen Mac computer. Rather, you're going to want something from, again, 2017, 2018 that addresses the most recent software that's available. Social sciences as well. And oftentimes, I'm thinking of psychology, sociology, just because, and of course, this can apply to other kind of subjects and areas as well. But making sure that information is up to date. So for example, if you're looking at something that's more grounded in sociology, for example, and you want to know what a specific demographic of a particular region looks like, and you're trying to make the argument for, what could we do in 2019? So you'll probably want the demographic information from 2017 or 2018 as opposed to 2002. So you can see how some topics and some areas can be more time sensitive. Now, if you are looking at something that's perhaps more theoretical, more abstract, or just doesn't have empirical data coming out, every single year, or as frequently as other areas might, that's totally fine. I'll use an example from my own research. I look at contemporary rhetorical theory. And while I'm not citing the Greeks, from 3,000 years ago, my audience wouldn't bat an eye if I cited someone from 1960 or 1970. Whereas if you're perhaps writing in the medical field about the newest ways to, again, approach cancer treatment, citing something from the 60s or 70s as still relevant to today might not be appropriate. But again, based off of the topic that I'm writing on and the subject that I'm exploring, perhaps that might not be as big of a thing, but that is something that you'll want to be aware of, to think of how does my audience view timelessness and timeliness in the publications that I'm citing. Really, what this comes down to, and the easiest question you can ask yourself is, regardless of what field you are researching in, is the information outdated? That is going to, again, have different meanings for different individuals based off of the argument they're making and the audience they're writing for. So again, for me, referencing stuff that was written in the 60s and 70s might not be outdated. Heck, that's kind of new stuff. But again, if you are, let's say, looking at immigration and you need the numbers to make your argument, the most recent numbers, no, you're not going to quote stuff from the 60s and 70s. You're going to quote stuff and pull information from 2017, 2018. So again, regardless of what your topic is and the field that you're working within, ask yourself, is the information outdated? If you say yes, it is, and you are just relying on that information to serve as evidence, then maybe you want to table that article for the time being. Maybe its currency isn't where it ought to be for your work. But if you find yourself saying, no, it's not dated, still applies, still entirely relevant in a more temporal sense on the topic, then carry on evaluating. The next component that we'll want to look at then will be relevance. And this is going to be the importance of the information for your reader. This, again, like currency, is going to change from one writer to the next based off of the topic that you're writing for and the topic that you're writing on and the audience that you're writing for. So when we think about relevance, we want to carefully consider what information and evidence your reader values. So you'll probably notice that in some topics, in some disciplines, for example, personal narrative is a big thing. Ethnographies are highly valued, whereas in other disciplines that might not be the case. So if you're trying to make an argument about regulating boating at Sand Hollow because of an algae that's growing, you probably won't need a narrative about people hanging out at the beaches of Sand Hollow to make that argument. Rather, you'd want the hardline numbers, because that is the kind of relevant information your readers would appreciate and that your readers would ultimately value. So other ways you can think about this, empirical data versus abstract theory. Some fields will say, we want the numbers, we want things that we can see, data that we can work with, whereas other fields are like, no, you're totally good with using more abstract theory, more philosophical approaches. Also, again, personal narrative versus impersonal collected data. So this might be, let's say you talk to someone who loves going boating at Sand Hollow, right? So that might be an appropriate, depending on your argument and your audience, you might say, hey, incorporating a personal narrative of someone who spends time out at Sand Hollow boating would be far more valuable than talking about a survey, an anonymous survey that I distributed. Or again, depending on your audience and the argument you're making, you might find yourself saying, oh, okay, well, this survey data that was collected is going to be far more valuable to my audience than me going out and interviewing someone who happens to go boating on Sand Hollow. So when you think about relevance, you want to think about what kind of information, support, evidence will my readers value, and what will help them see my point as that much more authoritative and persuasive. Speaking of authoritative, let's now talk about authority. So that is the source of the information. So who's writing it? And what are their qualifications in doing so? Circling back to Aristotle, who we talked about toward the beginning of the semester, this addresses the ethos of your sources. So this really gets at why do we view them as authoritative, and what have they done? So oftentimes, though, this is when you're going to recall back the example that we've referenced. So remember, with ethos, you can be like the priest who has years of training in the seminary, has worked for as a priest for a really long time, is a renowned scholar on religious studies or theology. So this person, this priest, has a lot of authority in the amount of work that they've done prior. So you will notice that many of the sources that you gather from the scholarly databases will kind of be like the priest in that sense, where they will be well-respected minds in the field. They will be individuals who have done extensive research and who are considered experts on their subject matter. Now, when we consider authority, things that we want to be aware of and reflect on is, why is this person considered an authority in their field? This can take on a couple of different approaches. For example, in some fields, perhaps having field experience, so actually going out and working with people or working with the focus of your study. Maybe that's more valuable. Maybe having more publications, or maybe, working with certain institutes, think tanks, universities, whatever the case may be. Maybe that is what determines someone as authoritative. You also want to be aware of why is their research viewed as valuable? So what does it contribute? So does it answer a previously unanswered question? Does it question an assumption that has long been accepted for truth? So why is the research that you're looking at, why is that considered valuable? What does it contribute to that overall body of knowledge? And then last but not least, are there any issues regarding the author's other works that I, as the writer, need to account for? So if you think about it this way, maybe this person has um, said things that might contradict their current research in earlier publications. Maybe they took a little bit of a hiatus and weren't as active. Things that the reader might be aware of to say, oh, hey, I see you're citing this person, but did you know that they took a break for like 5 years? Or did you know that they actually said the opposite thing earlier on in their career? So you do want to be aware, especially if you're citing a larger name in the field, you want to be aware of past discretions, if you will, that might complicate your audience accepting this source as authoritative right out the gate. Accuracy. Now, this goes back to the reliability, truthfulness, and correctness of the content. This is so important for avoiding fake news in your academic writing. So this is just making sure that the content is correct and factual. So some examples of inaccuracy and things that might make you say, maybe I should move on to another source and seriously consider using another source. So, vaccines cause autism. So that is inaccurate information. The Declaration of Independence was signed in 1785. Also an example of inaccurate information. So as you are reading your sources and really digging into what they're saying and the information that they are using to support their own claims and their own conclusions, you want to keep an eye out for, okay, well, are they being 100% honest? Are they being as correct as humanly possible with the information that they have available to them? So you just want to make sure that you are further circulating correct information that ultimately contributes to how people understand and engage with that information as evidence to your own claim. And last but not least, we also want to think about purpose. Now, this is the reason the information exists. So you want to think about, okay, well, why was this research conducted? Why did someone find this valuable enough to look into further? So it asks you as the reader and as someone who could potentially utilize that source in their own work, it asks you to examine the biases of the author and the situation. This is going to be especially important for some of you. So, like, for example, if you are researching the impacts of opioids, you want to make sure that a pharmaceutical company was not the one funding that research. Because if a pharmaceutical company was funding the research, then we can safely assume or reasonably assume that the purpose of the research was to promote a certain drug or a certain prescription. And so you could see how those biases might cloud the conclusions that are reached and the way that the information is presented. So, consider, why does the research exist? So, oftentimes in most academic works, um, regardless of the field, they will say, this is the hole in the research that we're trying to address. This is the gap that we see, and this is how we want to basically fill or address that gap. So, usually the most authoritative and valuable sources will find, will their purpose will be to address the gap in the scholarly research. It won't really be to be like to prove how effective this drug is, because you can kind of hear that sales pitchy type language. You also want to consider who funded the work. most of the time you will see either government agencies, universities, publicly funded sources who are more often than not publishing in the academic journals that you'll come across. But again, like I said, if you're researching opioids, you want to be aware if a pharmaceutical company or a similar type funding source is the one footing the bill, because it has been noted that oftentimes when this happens, when you get sort of these outside private companies who are funding research, they will take out, let's say if you're looking at a certain prescription, they'll say, oh, this makes our drug look really bad, take this out, or we won't publish it, or we won't continue your research. So because of that purpose might lead to inaccuracies in their content, which goes back to another question that we want to consider regarding purpose is who is served or directly benefits from the work. So you think about it, is it the general public, or is it a specific group of individuals? And in what way are they benefited by this research? So these are all questions that you want to consider when trying to determine what the purpose of a source or research is. Now, I will recommend, I think, some of the strongest evidence that you can incorporate, especially for Project 4, which focuses on engaging sort of public issues more closely. I would say strive to find sources that are meant to serve or benefit the general public. So rather than serving, let's say, a company or a certain industry, or maybe even a specific like government or political entity, try to find sources that are geared toward basically improving the life of the everyday person. So these are things that you will want to keep an eye out with purpose, especially as you are evaluating each source that you use for Project 3. So here's what you'll want to do for the lecture assignment. I want you to locate one source that you could or that you even plan to use for Project 3, the annotated bibliography. I'd then like you to compose a brief write-up evaluating that scholarly source. Each component should be about 30 words. So when you are talking about, let's say, purpose, that should be 30 words. When you're talking about accuracy, that should be 30 words. So each one should be a 30-word, approximately a 30-word discussion. And I will say, keep this work, keep it handy. In fact, you can use it in your drafting materials for Project 3. So maybe after doing this, you become comfortable with, okay, this is what the structure of an annotated bibliography looks like. And so you can keep it close and to help you write other entries and to sort of help inform your approach as you go. To round this lecture out, let's talk about the weekly homework. Be sure to include the summary and assignment for Core Lecture 16 in your Week 8 homework submission. Your Week 8 homework submission should also include the summaries and lecture assignments for Core Lectures 15, 16, and 17, as well as the summary and assignment for a mini lecture of your choice. And that is all due to Canvas by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, March 3rd. If you have any questions or would like to discuss these concepts in greater detail, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas DM. All right, everyone, until next time. Of the Craap principles.